How hard is it really to make a great cookie? After all, it's one of the first recipes that many of us make as kids. Yet while cookies may look simple, they're actually surprisingly complex. Even very small changes in ingredient quantities or mixing method can yield significant differences in flavor and texture. You'll see exactly what I mean as I show you how the Test Kitchen re-engineered the all-American chocolate chip cookie. We wanted better flavor and better texture. Now, what do I mean by better flavor? We wanted far more complexity, more toffee and butterscotch notes, which really balances the sweetness. As for texture, we wanted really crisp edges that would contrast with the moist, chewy center. And here's how we did it. Most chocolate chip cookie recipes start by creaming softened butter with sugar. Now the goal of creaming is to beat tiny pockets of air into the butter, which will then fill with gas and steam during baking. The result of this mixing method is a cookie with a higher rise and a cakier interior. But what if you're after a chewy cookie, not a cakey one? Well, then you don't want to cream the butter, but rather melt it. Not only is melting the butter easier, you don't need to break out a stand mixer, it also produces chewier cookies. One reason is that butter contains about 18% water, which, when freed from the butter during melting, mixes with the flour in the dough and forms gluten, which provides chew. In addition, melted butter means less air pockets, because we're not creaming, so less unwanted rise, we get denser, chewier cookies. The effect of melted butter can be seen in many classic cookies, including molasses spice, oatmeal raisin, and peanut butter cookies. So starting with melted butter is a really good first step. But for our recipe, we took things a little bit further by browning the butter as well. Brown butter, what the French call beurre noisette, or hazelnut butter, displays the complex aroma and flavor of nuts. It's an amazing transformation that we owe to the Maillard reaction, which is the same process that gives us that crust on a nice seared steak. Butter is an emulsion of water and fat, which breaks upon melting in the pan. Milk proteins and sugars that are in the butter then fry in the butter fat, and this is what produces hundreds of new flavor compounds. The good news is it's also very easy to do. So you want to make sure to use a light colored skillet like this one here. Using a non-stick skillet, it's simply too dark, you won't notice the color change. So I'm going to add my butter. You want to use medium heat, which is going to be a little bit more gentle. The other key is that you want to make sure you're swirling the pan so that the milk solids brown evenly. So first I'm going to let this melt, and then we'll watch that transformation take place. Okay, you can see that the butter is melted. Now some of that water that's come out of the butter is now evaporated. At this point you want to start swirling. It's going to allow that water to evaporate without making the hot fat pop out of the pan at you. You can also see some of the white milk solids starting to separate. They're on the surface right now, but they'll eventually settle to the bottom where they're going to start to brown. Okay, you can see that it's definitely starting to darken. And it really smells. I can smell kind of a nutty hazelnut aroma. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now the trick with brown butter is as soon as it's at the color you want, you need to get it out of the pan. I'm going to transfer it to this heat-proof bowl here. There's a lot of residual heat in this, so it's going to continue to brown even now that I've dropped it in here. So what I'm going to do is I have 10 tablespoons of butter in here. I'm actually going to add 4 more that haven't been browned. I'm going to stir these, which is going to cool down the whole mixture, which is great. The color won't continue to darken. It's also adding back some water, which we really drove off a lot of while we were browning the butter. So I'll stir this until it's totally cool. All right, great. That is all melted into it, and our butter has cooled down. Okay, so I set that butter aside, and now let's talk a little bit about the sugar in our recipe. We often think of sugar as providing sweetness, which it certainly does, but it also drastically affects the texture of baked goods. That's because sugar has an affinity for water. It's hygroscopic. The hydrogen and oxygen molecules in sugar and water are electrostatically attracted to each other, so they link together to form hydrogen bonds, which are very hard to break. As a result, sugar slows the evaporation of moisture from cookie dough or cake batter, ensuring a final product that is moist and tender. Now, all sweeteners are not created equal. If you use brown sugar rather than white sugar in a cookie, you not only end up with a different flavor, but also a different texture. Why? Granulated sugar is pure sucrose. Brown sugar is sucrose with some invert sugar. Sweeteners with a lot of invert sugar, now think honey, molasses, and even the molasses in brown sugar, are liquid. They have a very hard time crystallizing like sucrose. And invert sugar is even more hygroscopic or water-loving than sucrose. It can even draw in moisture from the air after a cookie is baked to keep it moist. So to demonstrate the effect of the invert sugar and brown sugar, I've made 2 oatmeal cookies, one with white sugar and one with brown sugar. Now look what happens when I try to get the cooled cookies to conform to the curvature of a rolling pin. This is the white sugar cookie. Breaks right in half. Now the brown sugar cookie contains a lot more moisture. It bends right around the pin, and that makes for a very chewy cookie. The classic Toll House chocolate chip cookie recipe calls for equal amounts white and brown sugar. To get the full benefit of invert sugar, we switch to 3 parts brown sugar to 2 parts granulated sugar. So that's 3/4 cup of dark brown sugar and 1/2 cup of granulated sugar. Now we tried using all brown sugar, but its flavor was really overpowering. But perhaps even more important than the ratio of the 2 sugars is how we added them to the butter. It turns out that sugar that is dissolved in liquid before baking caramelizes more readily than sugar that simply dissolves in the oven. For our perfect chocolate chip cookies, we let the wet ingredients in the batter rest for 10 minutes, whisking occasionally in order to dissolve the sugar. This step helps break down large sucrose molecules into smaller glucose and fructose molecules, which caramelize at lower oven temperatures. So we're in effect creating more invert sugar out of the granulated sugar. And as we now know, more invert sugar equals more caramelization and thus more flavor. So I'm going to add my brown sugar, which is 3/4 cup of dark brown, 1/2 cup of granulated sugar. I'm also adding a teaspoon of table salt and a full 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. So I'll whisk these into my brown butter until smooth. At this point, you really want to break up any big chunks of brown sugar. Okay, so now I'm going to add my eggs. And I'm actually using 1 whole egg and 1 yolk. The classic recipe on the back of the Nestle bag calls for 2 whole eggs. But that extra egg white protein can lead to a cookie that is cakey instead of nice and chewy and dense. I'll break these up and whisk it in. Now this egg is bringing with it a lot of water, and that's going to allow the sugar to dissolve. Okay, so I've whisked this for about 30 seconds, and as you can see, it's a lot smoother. Now I'm going to let it rest for about 3 minutes, whisk again for 30 seconds, and repeat that a couple more times. What we're doing during this 10-minute resting period is allowing a lot of that sucrose to break into glucose and fructose. More of it's going to dissolve, and we're going to get cookies with better browning. So with this method, as these cookies bake, the oven is going to evaporate moisture from the perimeter of the cookie first, while the remaining moisture is going to be retained in the center. Now that disparity is what will give us great contrast in texture, from a crisp rim to a chewy center. While I wait for the sugars to dissolve, I'm going to get the flour and leavener ready. In addition to the fat and how it's treated, and the sugar and how it's treated, the leavening agent makes a huge difference in the texture of cookies. Now we basically have 2 choices, baking soda and baking powder. Baking soda reacts with acidic ingredients such as sour cream, brown sugar, or molasses in a batter or dough to create carbon dioxide. As soon as the baking soda comes in contact with liquid, it reacts. So as a result, it doesn't have much of an impact on rise during baking. Baking powder, on the other hand, is baking soda mixed with a dry acid, such as cream of tartar, and double-dried cornstarch. The cornstarch absorbs moisture and keeps the baking soda and the dry acid from reacting until they become wet. Most baking powder that you find today is double acting. So there are 2 dry acids, and one, which is usually sodium aluminum sulfate, is heat activated above 120 degrees. This means that we get an extra boost of leavening once the cookies go into the oven. This additional rise is great for lots of baked goods. Many cookies are made with one leavener, some are made with both. The decision should be made based on the dough's other ingredients. For example, is there an acid available to react with the baking soda, as well as what the desired final texture of the cookie is. So for our chocolate chip cookies, we just have baking soda. Why? In addition to less rise, baking soda also helps with browning, which is something we want. Caramelization and browning occur best in an alkaline environment. So amino acid molecules, like those found in flour, have two ends, the amino end and the acid end. The acid end is acidic. The amino end is alkaline. So it's the alkaline end that has to react with the sugar molecules for the Maillard reaction to occur. In an acidic dough, the alkaline ends are basically deactivated. However, in an alkaline dough, created by the addition of baking soda, the amino ends thrive and they can react with the sugar to create browning. So I'm going to add my flour, and this is 1 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour and half a teaspoon of baking soda. And I'm just going to whisk these together. There's no need to sift these ingredients. Okay, so now I'm going to add my flour to my butter and sugar mixture, which is sat for about 10 minutes. Here, I'm just going to stir the two together. I'm using a wide spatula so you can get underneath the batter, pull up any of the dry flour that's sitting down there. Okay, so that's just combined. Now we're going to add our chocolate. These are chocolate chip cookies, so it's pretty important. We're using 1 1/4 cups of chocolate chunks. So it's basically a bittersweet chocolate bar that we've chopped up. We really like these nice big pieces of chocolate. Now I'm just going to fold this together so we get good even distribution of the chocolate. All right, that looks good. Okay, so we've got our dough together, but we're not quite done. For chewy cookies, you need to portion the dough carefully. In general, the larger the cookie, the better the contrast between the chewy center and the crisp exterior. For this reason, we use about 3 tablespoons of dough for each cookie. I'm actually going to do this using a portion scoop. Now, there are many different sizes of them. They look like small ice cream scoops. They all have a number that determines how big they are. So for this recipe, you want a 24 portion scoop, which is about 3 tablespoons. So I'm going to portion these out. And right now I'm just transferring them to a lightly greased baking sheet. Okay, so now I'm going to roll these into balls, and I'm going to transfer them to 2 baking sheets, 2 rimmed baking sheets that I've lined with parchment paper. And what I want to do is space them about 2 inches apart, which will give them plenty of room to spread. Okay, so my cookies are portioned out, and it's almost time to bake. Now, up to this point, we've worked really hard to create a dough that will yield chewy cookies. And it's important that we don't throw it all away by baking these cookies for too long. I'm going to put them in a 375-degree oven on the middle rack, 1 tray at a time, for about 10 to 12 minutes. Now, once the edges are golden brown and set, the cookies are done. The center will still look soft, and it's going to look underbaked, but that's okay, that's the point. We're going to let the cookies cool on the baking sheet, where residual heat in the pan will ensure that the center sets up just enough, but still remains chewy. So I'm actually setting my timer for 5 minutes, which is the halfway mark. Now at that point, I'm going to rotate the baking sheet to ensure that they brown evenly all over. Okay, so while our cookies bake, let's talk a little bit about baking sheets. And believe it or not, the type of baking sheet really matters a lot when you're making cookies. The material will really affect baking time a lot, with darker sheets browning cookies much faster than light ones. Even the presence or absence of rims on a baking sheet will change baking time. Sheets with no rims allow for greater air circulation and faster cooking than rimmed baking sheets. To prove the point, I've baked 2 identical batches of sugar cookies. Now these 2 sheets in front of me were both baked for the same length of time in the same oven, one after another, at the same oven temperature and on the same rack. The 1-inch rims all around this baking sheet diverted some of the hot air in the oven. Now, as you can see, these cookies are a lot lighter than these cookies over here, which baked without rims. You can get similar results, you just really need to adjust baking time. So these cookies baked for about 10 minutes. As you can see, we have some good browning around the outside. The center still looks very raw, and that's good. We're gonna let them sit, cool on the tray, and we're gonna have cookies with a nice crispy exterior and good chewy inside. Now I actually have a few cookies that I baked before, so we can see. Nice and chewy, with a really nice crisp exterior. So the great thing about these cookies, beyond their nice texture, is that you have a lot more of that butterscotch flavor from the way that we treated the sugar. We got a lot more Maillard reaction in the oven, so they're a lot more balanced. They're not just sweet. This is a real classic.